Calloway, get back to position. She didn't answer, because answering would have cost her the breath she needed for running. 3 shooters closing from the flank. Marsh down on one knee, dragging a wounded man by the strap of his vest. No cover, no time. 3 seconds between 6 men and the end of everything. So she threw herself into the gap. The first round caught her shoulder, spun her half around. She didn't go down. The second tore through her side, below the vest line. Her knees buckled. She didn't let them, because 110 pounds of woman was the only thing standing between an entire platoon and a body count. She planted her feet, raised the pistol with an arm that no longer felt like hers, and fired. They said she was just a civilian, just a contractor, just somebody's daughter. They were about to find out exactly whose.
The rifle found her hand before her mind caught up. Wren Calloway didn't remember picking it up. She never did. Some mornings it was just there, leaning against the porch rail like a dog waiting to be let out. Cold steel, already warm from her palm before she'd even opened her eyes all the way. Fog on the lake, low and gray and patient, the kind that swallowed sound before it could travel. She raised the scope, 300 yards, a pine cone balanced on a fence post her father built before she could walk. Wind coming from the northwest, maybe 6 miles an hour, maybe 7. She didn't check the flag anymore, didn't need to. Her body did the math before her brain finished the question. Exhale halfway. Hold. Squeeze between heartbeats. The pine cone exploded into a puff of brown dust, and the sound cracked across the water and rolled back off the mountains twice before it died. She lowered the rifle, didn't smile, didn't feel anything close to pride, because pride was for people who still had someone to show. The cabin sat quiet behind her, smoke curling thin from the chimney, 1 chair on the porch, just one. There used to be 2. Her mother's rocking chair was still inside, still facing the window, still angled toward the road like it was waiting for a truck that was never going to come back. Eleanor Calloway had sat in that chair for 17 years, waiting, not hoping. Wren had learned the difference a long time ago. Hoping had an end date. Waiting just had a chair and a window and a woman who refused to move either one. She died in that chair in March. Coffee gone cold in her hand, eyes still on the road. Wren buried her on the ridge behind the cabin, next to a grave that held nothing but a folded flag and a name. No body, no box. Just a stone the Navy paid for because paperwork demanded a stone exist. She stood there sometimes, not often. Talking felt foolish to dirt, but she stood there anyway, because someone had to. Because if she didn't, no one would. Which was the whole shape of her life now, wasn't it? A woman standing over 2 people who weren't really there. She went back inside before the fog burned off, set the rifle in its case, cleaned it the way her father taught her, every screw, every pin, because a rifle that isn't respected will fail you exactly when you need it most, and failure at 300 yards doesn't come with a second chance. His voice, still in her head after all these years. Discipline isn't what you do when someone's watching, Rennie. It's what you do when nobody is. Nobody was. Nobody had been for a long time. She made coffee she didn't finish, sat at the kitchen table with the local paper 3 days old because the mail truck only came twice a week this far out, and most of what it carried was bills addressed to a dead woman and catalogs for a life Wren had never wanted. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her mother. Lavender soap and burnt toast, some stubborn combination that refused to fade no matter how many months passed, no matter how many windows Wren left open to the cold September air. She used to think grief would feel like a wound, something sharp, something that healed at the edges, even if it left a scar. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like weather, some days clear, some days a fog that didn't lift no matter how long she waited on the porch for it to burn off. Today was somewhere in between. She worked when the work came. Overwatch contracts for a private security firm out of Billings, the kind of company that hired former operators and their strange, quietly gifted children to sit on ridge lines during high-value transports nobody in the news would ever hear about. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay like the movies made it look. But it kept her hands steady and her mind occupied, and some months that was the only thing standing between her and the particular kind of silence that lived in this cabin. Her last job had ended 9 days before her mother died. She'd come home from 3 weeks in the field to find Eleanor thinner than she remembered, coughing more than she let on, still insisting she was fine, still insisting the chair by the window was exactly where she wanted to be. Wren had sat with her every evening after that, made her tea she barely drank, read to her from paperback westerns because Eleanor said real books felt too much like homework at the end of a life. She never once, in those last 9 days, told Wren she was scared. She only ever said one thing that mattered near the end, her voice thin as paper. "He's out there somewhere, Rennie. I know he is. A mother knows." Wren had smiled and squeezed her hand and told her she was probably right, the way you tell a dying woman anything that might ease the last miles of the road. She hadn't believed it. Not really. 17 years of official silence had worn the hope out of her the way water wears down stone, slow and total and impossible to reverse. She believed it now, sitting at that kitchen table with a folder full of photographs that shouldn't exist, which meant her mother had been right the whole time and Wren hadn't believed her, and that particular guilt settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every memory of the last 9 days she thought she'd already made peace with. Snow instead of fog. Her father's breath fogging out in front of him as he knelt behind her, adjusting her elbow with 2 fingers. Small hands, small shoulders, a rifle that was almost bigger than she was. "Elbow down," he said. "Not locked. Locked bones shake. Relaxed bones don't." "It's heavy." "It's supposed to be heavy. Heavy means it's real." She squinted through the scope at a can 40 yards out. 40 yards felt like 40 miles. What if I miss? Then you learn something a hit never taught you. She missed. The can sat there smug and untouched, and she felt her 9-year-old heart crack a little at the edges. Until he laughed. Not at her, with her somehow, in a way only he could manage. "Again," he said. She fired 6 more times before she finally clipped it. It spun off the fence post, and she streamed like she'd won a war. He didn't cheer. He never did. He just nodded once. Slow. "That's the one you'll remember," he said. "Not the misses. That." She didn't understand it then. She understood it now. Every single miss lived in her the way sediment lives at the bottom of a lake. Quiet. Settled. Waiting for something to stir the water and bring it back up. There were other mornings like that one. Dozens of them strung together across 2 winters and a summer, her father teaching her the way his own father had taught him and his father before that. A chain of quiet mornings and cold hands stretching back further than she'd ever bothered to ask about. He taught her to read wind in the grass before she learned to read a clock. Taught her that a held breath was a kind of prayer, that patience wasn't the absence of urgency but the mastery of it. Taught her without ever quite saying so that the world would ask more of her than it asked of most people, and that the asking wouldn't always be fair. She hadn't understood that lesson either, not then. She remembered her mother too from those same years, though the memory sat in a softer register entirely. Eleanor on the porch steps in a housecoat calling them both in for supper while the light went purple over the ridgeline. Eleanor's hands flower to the elbow teaching Wren to roll dough on a Sunday while Silas cleaned his rifle at the same table, the 3 of them existing in the kind of easy domestic rhythm that never once felt like it was borrowed time. Wren hadn't known back then that it was. She remembered her mother laughing at something her father said, a sound so full and unguarded that it seemed to belong to a different woman entirely than the one who'd later spend 17 years going quiet in a rocking chair by a window. She remembered thinking at 9 years old that this was simply what a family was. Warm kitchens. Cold mornings on the range. A father who came home smelling like gun oil and pine. A mother who kept the porch light on no matter the hour. She hadn't understood at 9 that the porch light would stay on for 17 years after the reason for it stopped coming home. He was gone 11 months after that snowy morning, deployed on something he wasn't allowed to name, some operation stitched in the classification so tight even his own wife never got a straight sentence about it. 2 men from the Navy came up the driveway in dress blues on a Tuesday in October, and Wren watched from the window as her mother's knees gave out on the porch steps before the men even finished their first sentence.
Missing. Presumed dead. Presumed. That word had haunted the house for 17 years like a third resident nobody invited. It sat at the dinner table. It rode in the truck. It was there every single time the phone rang after dark, and Eleanor's whole body went rigid before she even answered it. Wren had grown up inside that word the way other children grew up inside a religion. Silent structuring impossible to fully escape. The kind of bar that still smelled like a different decade. Neon beer signs buzzing behind a bar top scarred with cigarette burns from back when that was still legal indoors. A jukebox that hadn't been updated since Reagan left office. Old men on stools who all had the same haircut and the same posture, spines straight even when the rest of them had gone soft. Wren sat in the corner booth, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Old habit. Older than she was, really, inherited, not learned. She wasn't there for the whiskey in front of her, untouched, sweating a ring onto the table. She was there because staying in the cabin one more night felt like drowning in a room with the windows painted shut. 4 days since the funeral reception ended, and the casseroles stopped coming, and the neighbors stopped calling to check on her. 4 days of silence so complete she'd started talking to the dog that wasn't there, because they hadn't kept a dog in years, not since the last one died of old age, and neither of them had the heart to replace him. The bell over the door rang. She didn't look up right away. Rule number 1, her father used to say, never confirm you noticed someone until you decide whether they're a threat. Boots. Heavy, deliberate, a man's gait that had spent decades walking in formation even when there was no formation left to walk in. He stopped at her booth. Wren Calloway. Not a question, a confirmation, like he already knew and just needed to hear it land in the air between them. She looked up. 60-something, gray buzz cut, a face carved from the same weathered granite as every retired operator she'd ever met, which admittedly wasn't many, because most of them didn't survive long enough to retire, or didn't survive retirement long enough to matter. Do I know you? No. He slid into the seat across from her without asking, another old habit. But I knew your father. Her stomach dropped through the floor. Everyone knew my father, she said, flat, practiced, the line she used on anyone who wandered too close to that particular grave. Doesn't make you special. Fair? He set a manila folder on the table, didn't open it, just let it sit there like a loaded weapon with the safety on. Name's Earl Danby. Served with Silas. 2 tours. Would have done a 3rd if things had gone different. Things went different for a lot of people. Yeah. Something moved behind his eyes, something old and unresolved. They did. She stared at the folder. What's that? Something you're not going to want to see. Then why'd you bring it? Because you're the only one left who can do something about it. Silence. The jukebox switched songs. Somewhere behind the bar, ice cracked into a glass. She reached for the folder. He put his hand flat on top of it. Not aggressive, careful, the way you'd stop a child from touching a stove. Before you open this, he said, I need you to understand something. Understand what? Your father wasn't presumed dead because of bad luck. Her jaw tightened. He was presumed dead because somebody needed him to be. She sat back against the cracked leather of the booth. Let that sentence find its footing somewhere in her chest because it landed like a stone dropped down a well, and she was still waiting to hear it hit bottom. You've been sitting on this a long time, she said. Longer than I'm proud of. Why now? Danby's jaw worked. For a moment he looked older than 60-something, older than the bar itself, older than the war stories the men on the stools behind him were probably still telling each other in low voices.
Because I've spent a year chasing a feeling I couldn't prove, he said. Old contacts, half answers, a supply chain that didn't add up right if your father was really gone. I kept telling myself I was an old man looking for ghosts because I didn't want to let go of my friend. And now? Now I've got more than a feeling. He tapped the folder once, lightly, like it might wake something up if he pressed too hard. And I didn't want you hearing it secondhand from someone in a uniform who never once sat at your family's table. Something in Wren's chest loosened just slightly at that. A small mercy in a conversation that had none to spare. Your mother, Danby said, quieter now. I heard. I'm sorry I didn't make it to the funeral. You knew her too. Everybody who served with your father knew Eleanor. She used to send Christmas cards to half the platoon, every year. Even the ones who'd transferred out, moved on, changed their numbers twice. He shook his head slowly. That's not a woman who deserved 17 years of not knowing. Wren's throat tightened. She looked away toward the neon glow of the beer sign until she trusted her own face again. So, what's in the folder? She said. Enough to get you killed if the wrong person finds out you have it. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a fact about weather. Enough to maybe finally answer the question your mother died still asking. She reached for it again. This time he let her take it. One more thing, Danby said before she could slide out of the booth. When you take this to whoever you decide to take it to, and you will take it to somebody, I can already see it in your face, you're your father's daughter down to the bone. Be careful who that somebody is. Meaning what? Meaning your father didn't get erased by accident, Wren. Somebody with real reach made that happen. Somebody who's still got that reach today, or this folder wouldn't still be dangerous 17 years later. He held her gaze steady. The same kind of steady she recognized from every photograph she'd ever seen of men who'd survived things they didn't talk about. The Navy didn't do this alone. Whoever's protecting this thing sits somewhere higher up than a base commander. Trust the uniform if you have to. Don't trust it blindly. That's not exactly reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. He stood, dropped a few bills on the table for a drink he'd never ordered, and paused at the edge of the booth like there was one more sentence caught behind his teeth that he wasn't sure he had the right to say. Your mother used to send me Christmas cards. Every year. Even after I stopped writing back because writing back felt like admitting your father wasn't coming home to read them with her. I should have come to you sooner. I'm sorry it took me this long to be brave enough. He walked out before she could answer. The bell over the door rang once, thin and small, against the noise of the bar, and then he was gone, swallowed by the dark parking lot and whatever life he'd built for himself in the 17 years since he'd last stood beside her father. She never saw him get in a car, never heard an engine start. When she looked out the window a few minutes later, the lot beyond the neon glow was empty, like he'd simply dissolved into the same fog that always seemed to be waiting for her, whether she was standing on a Montana porch or sitting in a Missoula bar 300 miles from home. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of the whiskey, which she hadn't finished. Not because of the drive home, 40 minutes of black highway and high beams catching nothing but deer eyes in the ditches. Because of the folder sitting on her kitchen table. Unopened. Daring her. She stared at it until 3 in the morning, and then she opened it. Photographs. Grainy. Long lens. A warehouse somewhere with corrugated steel walls and a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Crates stacked in neat military rows, stenciling on the sides she recognized instantly because her father had drilled the alphabet soup of Army and Navy ordnance codes into her before she was old enough for algebra. Rifles, explosives, serial numbers that traced back according to a typed page clipped behind the photos to a supply chain that should have been destroyed. Decommissioned. Accounted for. Except it wasn't decommissioned, it was for sale, and stapled to the last page almost like an afterthought, almost like the whole folder had been building toward this one small, devastating detail. A unit patch. Recovered from the site, torn, burned at one corner. Her father's unit patch, not a similar one, not a generic one issued to 100 different teams over 20 years. His. She sat there with her hand pressed flat against her mouth because if she didn't hold it there, whatever was building behind her ribs was going to come out as a sound she didn't want to hear herself make. Because that patch was supposed to be in a box, in a drawer, in her mother's closet, wrapped in tissue paper that had gone yellow with age, untouched since the funeral that buried an empty coffin. Until now. Which meant someone had taken it out of that drawer, or it had never made it into the drawer at all. Which meant, she stopped herself, physically shook her head like she could rattle the thought loose before it finished forming, because some thoughts, once they exist, can't be put back in the box they came from. She read the typed pages twice more before dawn, names blacked out in 3 places. A shipping manifest that routed through a private logistics firm registered in Delaware, the kind of shell company that existed for exactly one purpose. A date, 17 years old, almost to the week, that matched nothing in any record Wren had ever been shown about the operation that took her father. Nothing matched. That was the whole horror of it. 17 years of official silence, and here was a folder full of threads that didn't connect to any story she'd ever been told, because nobody had ever bothered giving her a story that was true. She didn't sleep. She packed instead. The drive east took 2.5 days, most of it alone, with a folder riding shotgun and a radio she never turned on, because the silence felt more honest than anything a station could offer her. She stopped the first night at a diner outside Rapid City, the kind of place with a chalkboard special and a waitress who called every customer honey regardless of age. She sat at the counter with a plate of eggs she barely touched, the folder locked in the truck where she could still see it through the window because some habits from a childhood spent watching her father check locks twice weren't habits she knew how to set down. The old man on the next stool wore a faded cap with a ship's name stitched across the front. The kind of cap that only made sense to men who'd once stood on that ship's deck and never quite left it behind. He caught her staring at the insignia. "You know the boat?" he asked. Friendly. The particular friendliness of a man who missed conversation more than he'd ever admit out loud. "My father served," she said. "Different unit. Same era, maybe." "Yeah. What was his name?" She hesitated, some old instinct telling her not to say it out loud in a diner 3 states from anywhere that mattered. But something in the old man's face, kind, weathered, entirely unthreatening, loosened the caution in her chest just enough. "Calloway," she said. "Silas Calloway." The old man's fork paused halfway to his mouth, set it down slow like the name had cost him something to hear. "Master Chief Calloway," he said. Not a question. "I didn't serve with him direct, but I heard the name plenty back when I was still in. Good man, they said. The kind other men wanted standing next to them when things went sideways." He studied her a moment longer, something working behind his eyes. "You're his girl." "I am." "Heard he was lost. Long time back now." 17 years, Wren said. The old man nodded slow, looked down at his coffee like it had suddenly gotten more interesting than the conversation. "That's a hard kind of missing," he said quietly. "The kind with no answer at the end of it. My brother went down that road too. Different war, different reasons. Man spends the rest of his life half a person waiting on news that never lands." He looked up at her again, and something in his expression had gone gentle in a way that surprised her, coming from a stranger in a roadside diner at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. "You look like you're chasing something." "Maybe." "Well." He picked his fork back up, returned his attention to his plate like the conversation had reached its natural end. "I hope you catch it." She paid for her eggs and left before the coffee went cold, carrying that small, unexpected kindness with her back out into the parking lot, back into the truck, back onto a highway that stretched all the way to Virginia, and a folder that rode shotgun the entire way, like something alive. The gate guard checked her ID twice. Not because anything was wrong with it, because a 5'3" civilian woman requesting entry with a classified case number scrawled on a post-it note didn't fit any pattern he'd been trained to expect. "Ma'am, I need you to wait here." "I've been waiting 17 years, she said. 10 more minutes won't kill me." He didn't laugh, but something in his face softened just slightly, like the words had landed somewhere real. She waited in a gray room with a gray table and a coffee machine that hadn't been cleaned since the previous administration. Fluorescent lights humming a note just off-key enough to itch at the base of her skull. A woman came in before Marsh did. Middle-aged, kind-faced, a lanyard around her neck that read, "Family Readiness," in block letters, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee like she'd already decided Wren would need one, whether she asked for it or not. "You must be Miss Calloway," the woman said, setting 1 cup down within reach. "I'm Carol. I do family liaison work for the base. They asked me to sit with you while you waited, if that's all right." "I don't need a babysitter." "No," Carol agreed, unoffended, settling into the chair across the table like she had all the time in the world, which Wren suspected was precisely the point of her being there. "But some people need a familiar kind of face in a room like this one, even if they'd never admit it. I've sat with a lot of families over the years. I know the look." "What look?" "The one that says you've been waiting for news so long you've stopped believing news is a thing that happens to people like you." Carol's voice was gentle, but there was nothing pitying in it, and Wren found herself grateful for that distinction. "I sat with your mother once, you know." "A long time ago." "Right after." Wren's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" "Briefly. I was younger then, newer to this job. She came in asking questions nobody had good answers for, and I remember thinking I'd never seen a woman hold herself together with so little to hold on to." Carol wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup, looking down into it like the past lived somewhere in the steam. "She talked about you. Said her daughter had her husband's hands and her husband's aim and probably, God willing, none of his luck." Something cracked open behind Wren's ribs, sudden and unexpected, in a way 3 days of driving alone hadn't managed to do. "She used to say that," Wren said, quiet. "About the hands. She was proud of you. Even then, even not knowing what you'd grow into." Carol reached over briefly and rested a hand on Wren's wrist, the kind of touch that asked nothing and gave everything. "Whatever's about to happen in that room, Ms. Calloway, you carry more of them with you than you probably realize. Both of them." Wren nodded, throat too tight to answer properly, and was still holding on to that thought, still turning it over like a stone in her palm, when the door opened again and Ellis Marsh walked in. She'd waited in rooms like this before. Once as a child when the Navy called her mother in for a follow-up briefing that never actually briefed anything. Once again at 19 filing a records request that came back redacted so thoroughly it looked like abstract art. Every room the government kept for grieving families seemed to share the same gray paint, the same tired light, as if grief itself had a government contractor and this was the only palette approved for the job. The door opened. He walked in like men like that always walked in, like the room had been built around him instead of the other way around. Tall. Not broad, exactly, but dense. The kind of build you get from 20 years of load-bearing work that has nothing to do with a gym. "Lieutenant Commander Ellis Marsh." He set a folder of his own on the table, thicker than Danby's official, stamped in 3 places with words she wasn't cleared to read. "Ms. Calloway." "Commander." He studied her for a long moment, longer than professional courtesy required, like he was trying to find someone else's face hiding underneath hers. "You've got his eyes," he said finally. Her chest tightened. "Whose?" "Don't do that. Not unkind, just tired. You know whose." She said nothing. "I served under your father," Marsh said, "before I had this rank, before I had this face full of lines. He was the reason I made it out of 2 deployments that had no business letting anyone make it out. Then you understand why I'm here. I understand why you think you're here." He slid the thick folder toward her, didn't open it yet. Left his hand resting on top, same as Danby had, like the men in her life had all silently agreed on the same gesture of caution. "I don't think you understand the size of what you just walked into. Try me." He studied her again, and this time something in his expression shifted, recalculated her upward, the way men like that recalculated targets when new intelligence came in.
Fine, he said. We've been tracking a weapons pipeline for 8 months. Decommissioned ordnance resurfacing on the black market, high grade, military specific. Not the kind of thing that leaks by accident. I saw the photos. You saw some of them. He tapped the folder. There's more in here, including something we haven't made public. Something we didn't even confirm until 11 days ago. Which is? He hesitated, and in years of reading rooms and reading men, Wren had learned that hesitation from someone like Marsh wasn't weakness. It was dread. The man running this pipeline, he said slowly, isn't some stranger we've never heard of. Then who is he? Marsh opened the folder himself this time, slid a single photograph across the table face down, like even showing it right side up too fast might do damage. She turned it over. A man, 60s maybe, weathered the same way Danby was weathered, the same way every operator from that era seemed to be weathered, like the job carved something identical into all of them, regardless of what they'd started out looking like. But it was the eyes that stopped her breathing. She'd seen those eyes in home movies, in a photograph on her mother's mantel for 17 years. A photograph of 2 young men in fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like the world hadn't taught them anything yet about what it could take from them. That's... Her voice cracked in a way she hated, in a way she hadn't allowed it to crack in years. That's Victor. Victor Lassiter, Marsh confirmed. Quiet, careful, watching her face the way you'd watch a structure you weren't sure was going to hold weight. Your father's closest friend. Served 2 tours side by side, declared dead the same week your father was declared missing. That's not possible. It's not just possible, Marsh said. It's confirmed. Facial recognition. Voice print from an intercepted call. Fingerprints lifted off a shipment crate 3 weeks ago. Wren stared at the photograph until the edges of it blurred. Because Victor Lassiter had sat at her family's dinner table, had taught her to whittle a slingshot out of a fallen branch when she was 7, had cried, actually cried, this huge granite block of a man, tears running silent down a face that never showed anything at her father's empty casket funeral, which meant he'd stood over a grave he knew was a lie, which meant every tear had been a performance, which meant, he's alive, she whispered, not a question, a collapse. He let us bury nothing. He let my mother die waiting by a window for 17 years, and the whole time he was... She couldn't finish it. Marsh didn't fill the silence for her. He let it sit. Let it do what silence does to grief, turn it slowly into something with edges, something usable. There's something else, he said finally. She looked up. There's more. There's always more. He exhaled long and low, like the words physically cost him something. The unit that ran your father's operation 17 years ago. The one that came back and told your mother he was presumed dead. What about it? It was mine. The room went very still. Not my command, he added quickly. I was a junior officer. I wasn't the one who wrote the report, but I was there, Ms. Calloway. I was on that op. And what got written up afterward? He stopped himself. Started again. What got written up afterward wasn't exactly what happened. Her hands had gone cold on the table. What happened? She said, not loud. Louder than a whisper would have carried, though, in that small gray room. I can't tell you everything. Not here. Not yet. Some of it's still classified above both our clearances. He met her eyes, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something cracked open in his composure. Something that looked almost like guilt wearing a uniform. But I can tell you this much. Your father didn't die in that operation. Then what happened to him? I don't know, Marsh said, and it sounded horribly like the truth. Nobody filed a body. Nobody filed proof. Just a presumption signed off fast, filed faster, and buried under enough classification that nobody ever had to answer for it. She sat back. The gray room tilted slightly the way rooms do when the floor underneath your entire life quietly reveals itself to be a stage set. 17 years, she said. I know. My mother died waiting for a truck that was never coming because everyone told her there was nothing left to wait for. I know. And you're telling me now because we need you, Marsh said, plainly, no softening it. Because Victor Lassiter is running a weapons pipeline that's about to arm people who should never get their hands on American ordnance, because he trusts almost no one left alive, and because the one person who might be able to get close enough to stop him, the one person whose face he might not put a bullet in on sight, is sitting across this table from me right now. Wren looked down at the photograph again. At the eyes she'd trusted as a child, at the man who'd taught her to whittle, who'd wept at a lie he built himself. Something in her chest that had been frozen for 17 years cracked. Not broke, cracked. The way ice cracks right before it gives way entirely. No, she said. Marsh didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded once, slow, like he'd expected exactly that answer and had already planned 3 moves past it. All right, he said. Go home, Miss Calloway. She stood, folder still in her hand because some part of her wasn't ready to let go of it, even as her mouth insisted she was walking away. She made it as far as the parking lot before the second thoughts started chasing her across the asphalt. Sat in her truck for 20 minutes with the engine off, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing, replaying every version of her mother's face she could remember. The young one from photographs, laughing on a beach somewhere before Wren existed. And the old one, gray and thin and fixed on a window that never once delivered what she was watching for. She thought about Earl Danby's voice in that bar. You're the only one left who can do something about it. She thought about Victor Lassiter crying at an empty funeral. She turned the truck back on, drove back through the gate, told the guard she needed 5 more minutes. He let her through without checking her ID again. She found Marsh in the same gray room, still sitting where she'd left him, going through his own folder like he already knew she was coming back. You didn't leave, he said, not quite a question. I got as far as the parking lot. What changed your mind? She set the folder down on the table between them, looked at the photograph of Victor Lassiter one more time, memorizing the shape of a lie she'd carried her whole life without knowing it. That photo, she said. The one of Victor. Where was it taken? 3 weeks ago, surveillance drone, West Virginia, Appalachian foothills. And the shipment, where's it headed? We don't know yet. When's the next one scheduled to move? Marsh's expression shifted. Careful. Reading her the way she'd been reading rooms her whole life. 6 days, he said. She stood in that doorway a long moment, long enough for the fluorescent hum to fill the whole silence between them. I want everything you have, she said finally. Every file, every photo, every intercept. Ms. Calloway, you said I might be able to get close to him. Her voice didn't shake this time, not even a little. It came out low and level and entirely her father's. Then get me close. Marsh studied her for a long, quiet beat, and something in his face, relief maybe, or something adjacent to it, tangled up with guilt he hadn't finished carrying, settled into place. Welcome back, Calloway, he said. Not to the Navy, she'd never worn the uniform. Welcome back to the fight her father never got to finish. She walked out of that gray room with the folder pressed against her chest like armor, and somewhere behind her ribs a version of herself that had spent 17 years standing over 2 graves that weren't really graves, finally, quietly, stood up straight. Because somewhere out there, past 6 days and a mountain range and a man wearing a dead man's face, her father was still a question with no answer. And Wren Calloway had spent her whole life learning how to hit things other people said were impossible to hit. She wasn't about to stop now. Behind her, the base hummed with its ordinary evening business sailors crossing the yard in 2s and 3s, a flag being lowered with the same slow ceremony it had been lowered with for 200 years. The ocean, somewhere past the buildings, breathing in and out, against a shoreline that had outlasted every war anyone had ever fought beside it. She didn't look back at the gray building. Didn't need to. Whatever answers were waiting for her now weren't behind her anymore. They were 6 days and 1 mountain range away, wearing a stolen life like it belonged to him.
And for the first time since the funeral, since the folded flag, since the 17 years of a woman waiting by a window for a truck that never came, Wren Calloway felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear. It felt unmistakably like purpose. She got in the truck, started the engine, and began driving toward whatever came next, because sitting still had never once brought her family a single answer, and she was done waiting for one to arrive on its own. She checked into a motel near the base that night, the kind with a flickering vacancy sign and a bedspread that had seen 3 decades of Navy families passing through on temporary orders. She sat on the edge of the bed with Marsh's folder open across her knees, reading by the weak light of a bedside lamp, memorizing faces and coordinates and shipment dates until the words started to blur together. Somewhere around midnight, she found herself looking at the photograph of Victor Lassiter again. Not the surveillance still Marsh had shown her, but a different one, tucked further back in the file, an older photo, decades old, black and white. 2 young men in fatigues with their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at a camera, like the world hadn't taught them anything yet about what it could take from them. She recognized it instantly. It was the same photograph that had sat on her mother's mantel for 17 years, dusted every week without fail, though Wren had never once in all that time thought to ask why her mother kept a photo of her husband's best friend displayed as prominently as her wedding portrait. She understood it now. Eleanor hadn't kept that photo out of nostalgia for a friendship. She'd kept it because some part of her, some quiet, unspoken part, had never fully believed the story the Navy gave her. Because if Victor Lassiter was dead too alongside her husband in the same operation on the same terrible day, then keeping his photograph on the mantel was its own small act of refusal. A woman who wouldn't let either of them be erased, even if the whole rest of the world had already decided they were gone. Wren pressed her palm flat against the photograph the way she used to press her palm against the cold glass of her mother's bedroom window on winter mornings, checking to see if the world outside had changed overnight. It hadn't changed most mornings, but some mornings it had. Some mornings the fog lifted and revealed something none of them expected to still be standing there. She thought about that as she finally turned off the lamp, about fog and patience and the particular kind of faith it takes to keep a photograph dusted for 17 years on the strength of nothing but a mother's unprovable certainty. 6 days. A mountain range, a man wearing her father's oldest friend's face like a mask he'd forgotten how to take off. She closed her eyes in a motel room 3,000 miles from the porch where all of this began, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her last waking thought wasn't grief. It was a plan. Careful, deliberate, built, one detail at a time, the way her father had taught her to build everything that mattered, patiently, without shortcuts, with room left over for the wind to change. Tomorrow she would meet the men who were about to become her team. Tomorrow, the 6 days Marsh had given her would start counting down in earnest. But tonight, for just a little while longer, she let herself hold on to the quiet certainty that had settled into her chest somewhere between the diner in Rapid City and the gray room on base. She was not done yet. Neither, she was beginning to believe, was he. 6 men in the room, all of them SEALs, all of them looking at her like she was a stray dog somebody had let wander into a kennel full of wolves. She didn't blame them. Because she wasn't Navy, wasn't trained the way they were trained, wasn't vetted the way they'd all been vetted, background checks, stacked 12 deep psyche vows, the whole machine that turned boys into instruments. She was just a woman with a rifle and a dead father's face memorized on a stranger. Marsh made the introductions fast, the way men like him did everything, no wasted motion. Doss, the loud one, already sizing her up like a problem he hadn't finished solving. Cole, quiet, watchful. The kind of stillness that made you forget he was in the room until he spoke. 4 others whose names she'd learned properly once trust had a reason to exist between them. A communications specialist named Reyes Pratt, who never looked up from his laptop. A medic called Hollis, who nodded at her once professionally, the way you'd nod at any piece of equipment you hoped you wouldn't need to use. And 2 more, whose faces blurred together in that first tense hour, indistinguishable until the mountain sorted out which of them she'd trust with her life and which she wouldn't.
This is a mistake,
said Doss. Broad, blonde, the kind of confidence that had never once been tested by consequence. No offense. Offense taken, Wren said. Try again? A ripple went through the room, not laughter, exactly, something adjacent to it. Respect, maybe still deciding whether to commit. Marsh stood at the head of the table, didn't smile, didn't need to.
She's not here to carry your gear, he said. She's here because Lassiter will let her walk within 50 yards of him before he lets any of you within 500.
And if she freezes, she won't. You don't know that. I know her father, Marsh said. Flat, final. Sit down, Doss. Doss sat down. Wren felt something warm move through her chest. Not pride, exactly, something closer to being seen, which was rare enough in her life that it nearly knocked the breath out of her, until she caught herself feeling it and shut it down, because feelings like that were exactly the kind that got people killed at 300 yards in bad wind. For what it's worth, Cole said quietly from the far end of the table, the first thing he'd said since the introductions. I read your file. Overwatch work out of Billings, 3 years, clean record, 2 commendations from clients who don't hand those out easy. He met her eyes, steady. You didn't need your father's name to earn a seat at this table. Figured you should hear that from somebody, even if nobody else says it out loud. The room went quiet in a different way after that. Not hostile quiet, considering quiet. Wren nodded once, grateful for it more than she let her face show, and filed the moment away next to the small handful of others from that week that had made the weight a little easier to carry. The map came up on the screen, satellite imagery, a compound tucked into a fold of the Appalachian foothills, invisible from the road, invisible from most angles of sky, camouflaged the way only people who understood exactly how surveillance worked could camouflage something. 6 days becomes 4, Marsh said. Shipments moving early. We move tomorrow at 0400. That's not enough prep time, said a younger operator. Cold, tall, quiet. The kind of stillness that made you forget he was in the room until he spoke. It's the time we have. With respect, sir, respect doesn't move the clock, Marsh said. Lassiter does. Silence settled over the room, heavy. The kind that comes right before people start checking their gear for the 3rd time, not because it needs checking, but because their hands need something to do. Wren studied the map, found the ridgeline that gave the best sightline into the compound's northern approach, found it before anyone else in the room said a word. There, she said, pointed. That ridge, 600 yards, clear line into the loading bay. Marsh followed her finger, so did every man at the table. That's outside effective range for most of our rifles, Doss said. Not for mine. Lady 600 yards in mountain wind with elevation changes, I've made that shot at 800, she said. Quiet, not bragging, just true the way facts are true whether or not you enjoy hearing them. In worse wind, with a rifle my father built by hand in a garage that didn't have electricity half the winter, Doss opened his mouth, closed it again. Marsh almost smiled, almost. Ridge is yours, he said. Cole Doss, you're her security element. Rest of us go in through the tree line on the east face. And if things go sideways, Doss said, who's pulling her out? Nobody, Wren said before Marsh could answer. I pull myself out. Every time. That's the deal. Doss looked at her a long moment. Your old man really build you like this? He said. Or did it just happen? Both, she said. Neither. Doesn't matter. Get some sleep, Doss. 0400 comes fast. She didn't sleep either. Lay on a cot in the barracks with her eyes open, staring at a ceiling that wasn't hers in a building that wasn't hers, preparing to hunt a man who used to teach her how to skip stones. Victor. She kept trying to picture him the way Marsh's photograph had shown him, older, harder, a stranger, wearing a memory's face. And every time her brain betrayed her, kept sliding back to the version that used to swing her up onto his shoulders at 4th of July barbecues, the version that called her Rennie Bird because her father called her Rennie, and Victor always needed to do everything just slightly bigger, which meant she was about to put a scope on a man who used to catch her when she jumped off the dock, until the memory cracked apart in her chest and something colder rushed in to fill the space.
Because that man let her mother die waiting. That man stood at a funeral and cried tears that meant nothing because he already knew the coffin was empty, because he was the reason it was empty, because she sat up, pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw white static instead of thoughts. Discipline isn't what you do when someone's watching, Rennie. I know, Dad, she whispered to an empty barracks room. I know. She didn't sleep. She just waited for 0400 the way she'd waited for everything else her whole life. Somewhere around 3 a.m, the door creaked open and Cole slipped in, sat on the empty cot across from hers, said nothing for a long while. Just sat there in the dark like a man who understood the particular kind of insomnia that comes before a mission where the target used to be family. You don't have to talk, he said eventually. Figured you might not want to be alone with it, though. With what? Whatever's keeping you awake. She almost laughed, almost told him it wasn't just one thing keeping her awake. It was 17 years of things stacked one on top of the other until the weight of them had a shape all its own. You ever have to hunt someone you loved? She asked instead. Cole was quiet a moment. Not exactly, but I've had to pull a trigger on someone wearing a face I recognized from a training photo. Fought beside him 2 rotations back before he went bad. It's not the same as family, but it's not nothing either. How'd you live with it? Same way you'll live with whatever happens tomorrow, Cole said. You remember the people it saved, not the one it cost. He left before dawn without another word, and Wren sat with that sentence a long while, turning it over like a stone in her palm, until 0400 finally arrived, and there was no more time left for turning anything over at all. She spent the last hour before the trucks rolled out the way she'd spent 1,000 hours before it back on the porch in Montana, cleaning the rifle. Not because it needed it, because her hands needed the ritual, needed the particular calm that came from taking something apart and putting it back together with more care than the moment strictly required. Every screw, every pin. Her father's voice threading through the motions the way it always did, unbidden, uninvited, permanent. A rifle that isn't respected will fail you exactly when you need it most. She thought about Victor's hands doing this same ritual once upon a time at her family's kitchen table, the 2 men trading tools back and forth like brothers who'd long since stopped needing to ask. She wondered if he still cleaned a rifle the same careful way, or if 17 years of running from whatever truth had swallowed him whole had worn that discipline down to something careless, something that no longer respected the weight of what it held. She hoped in some small, ungenerous corner of her heart that it had, because if Victor Lassiter had let himself go careless, that meant some part of the man who used to teach her to whittle had actually died in that operation 17 years ago, even if his body hadn't. And there was a strange, complicated mercy in that thought that the person she was about to hunt might not be the same person her mother had once set a place for at Thanksgiving. It made what came next easier to carry. Not easy, just easier. Fog again. Different mountains, same silence. She was starting to think fog followed her on purpose, some kind of cosmic curtain that only rose when something was about to be revealed. The climb up the ridge took 40 minutes. Cole ahead, Doss behind, neither of them saying much, all 3 of them moving the way people move when noise costs lives. She set up the rifle at the crest of the ridge, bipod legs deployed, silent, the way she'd done it 1,000 times on a lakeshore that suddenly felt very far away. 600 yards below the compound sat like a wound in the hillside. Corrugated steel roofs, a loading bay with its doors rolled halfway up, trucks, men moving crates in practiced, unhurried rows. And there, a man stepped out of the main building, gray hair cropped close, a build that had gone thick with age but hadn't lost its density, hadn't lost the way it moved, like something coiled. She found his face in the scope. Her hands didn't shake, her whole soul did. Victor Lassiter stood in the loading bay giving orders to men half his age, and something about the ease of it, the total unbothered ease, made her stomach turn over like spoiled milk. Because he looked happy.
17 years her mother spent, dying by inches next to an empty window, and this man had built himself an entire second life, calm and thriving and unburdened, less than 400 miles from the house where he used to eat Sunday dinner.
Confirmed target, came Marsh's voice low through her earpiece.
Confirmed, she said, voice steady in a way that scared her a little, because how do you sound that steady about a man you used to call uncle? Victor Lassiter, loading bay, 11 o'clock from the east tree line. Copy. Hold position. We're moving in on the east face now.
Copy. She watched through the scope as 6 shapes, Marsh's team, began their slow crawl through the tree line below.
Silent. Precise. The kind of movement that only exists after years of training your own body not to betray you. They were 400 yards from the compound's eastern fence when the first shot cracked the fog wide open.
Not from Marsh's team. From inside the compound.
Contact! Contact east!
Marsh's voice, sharp now, urgent, cutting through the calm like a blade through canvas.
They knew we were coming. Repeat, they knew!
Wren's stomach dropped, because that meant somebody talked, which meant somebody in that briefing room or somewhere above it had a line straight into Lassiter's compound, which meant this whole operation had been compromised before it even started, and she was 600 yards up a ridge with a rifle and no idea who to trust anymore. Through the scope, chaos erupted. Men pouring out of the compound buildings, weapons up, muzzle flashes strobing through the gray morning like something out of a nightmare edited for speed.
DOS Cole cover positions,
she said, voice flat, professional, the panic shoved down somewhere it couldn't reach her hands. I've got eyes on Marsh's team. She found them through the scope, pinned behind a fallen log at the tree line, taking fire from at least 4 positions, no clear angle to advance or retreat.
Marsh, talk to me!
We're pinned. 2 down, not KIA, but pinned and bleeding. We need that loading bay suppressed or we're not getting out of these trees. She found the loading bay again, 2 shooters positioned behind stacked crates, laying steady fire down into the tree line where Marsh's team huddled. 600 yards. Crosswind, maybe 8 miles an hour, now stronger than it had been an hour ago. Elevation drop of nearly 40 feet. Her father's voice unbidden, arriving exactly when she needed it. Wind reads the grass before it reads your face. Watch the grass, Rennie. She watched the grass, found her adjustment. Half a breath out, steady. Fire between the beats of her own pulse. The first shooter dropped before the crack of the shot even finished rolling across the valley. She cycled the bolt, found the second. Same rhythm, same stillness, the same terrible necessary certainty carried in a different set of words this time, because her father had taught her 100 ways to say the same prayer. He dropped too. Base clear, she said, and her voice didn't shake, even though everything underneath it was shaking hard enough to rattle her teeth. Marsh, move now. Copy, moving. And then Victor Lassiter stepped back into the loading bay doorway, looked up, looked directly at the ridge, at her position. 600 yards, and somehow impossibly, he was looking dead at her, like he'd known exactly where to look the whole time. Their eyes never actually met, not really, not at that distance, not through a scope and 600 yards of fog and gun smoke, but it felt like they did. His mouth moved. She couldn't hear it, didn't need to. She could read the shape well enough. Rennie bird. Her whole body went cold. Contact behind you, Doss's voice sharp, urgent, and she spun around just in time to see 2 men breaking through the tree line behind their ridge position, weapons already raised. Everything happened at once. Doss fired. 1 man dropped. Cole returned fire, caught the second in the shoulder, not a kill shot, and the man staggered but didn't go down. Kept coming, kept firing wild rounds that chewed bark off the trees around them. Wren dropped the rifle's angle. No time for a scope. Shot at this range, drew the sidearm at her hip instead and put 2 rounds into the second man's chest before her mind had even fully processed the decision. He went down. Stayed down. Silence. Sudden. Total. The kind of silence that rings louder than the gunfire it replaces. Report! Marsh's voice breathless, running. Report somebody now! Ridge secure, Doss said, voice tight. 2 hostiles down, we're clear. Loading bays compromised. Wren said. "Lassiter's gone. He saw us. He's pulling back." "Copy. All elements fall back to Rally Point Bravo." Now, this whole thing's blown. They fell back through the tree line at a pace just short of running, Doss ahead, Cole covering the rear. Wren's rifle slung tight across her back and her hands still not quite steady around the pistol grip. Her whole body ran on some kind of borrowed current, adrenaline burning clean through the fear underneath it. Until they reached the rally point, until she saw Marsh's face, pale jaw, tight, blood soaking through a field dressing on his upper arm. "You're hit," she said. "It's nothing. Marsh, it's nothing," he said again, sharper this time. And then quieter, almost to himself. "We were compromised. Somebody knew we were coming before we even left Norfolk." The words landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Who?" she said. Marsh didn't answer right away, looked at her instead, long, searching, like he was trying to decide how much truth she could carry before it broke something in her that couldn't be put back together. "Not here," he said finally. "Not like this." Marsh sat at a kitchen table that hadn't held a meal in years, letting a medic stitch the gash in his arm without so much as a wince, because men like Marsh had trained their faces not to show pain, the same way they'd trained their hands not to shake. Wren stood across from him, arms crossed, waiting. "You said somebody talked," she said. "I said we were compromised. Same thing. Not exactly." He flexed his hand as the medic tied off the last stitch, dismissed him with a nod, and waited until the door clicked shut before he spoke again. "There's a difference between a leak and a legacy." "Explain that." Marsh rubbed a hand down his face. Suddenly, he looked every one of his years, and then some, like the last hour had aged him a decade in the space of 40 minutes. 17 years ago, he said, when your father's operation went sideways, I told you I was there. I told you the report didn't match what happened. You did. What I didn't tell you, he said, is why. She waited. The silence in that farmhouse kitchen stretched thin enough to hear the generator ticking somewhere behind the walls. Your father's unit wasn't just running an op that night, Marsh said. They stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to find. A shipment, off the books. Ordnance that should never have existed outside a destruction order moving through a supply chain that had somebody's fingerprints all over it. Somebody well above a Master Chief's pay grade. Wren's chest tightened. What happened? There was a firefight that wasn't supposed to happen, Marsh said. Your father's team took fire from people who should have been allies, friendly uniforms, wrong intentions. He paused, swallowed. 2 men didn't make it out. Your father was one of the ones who did, barely. Last confirmed sighting had him wounded, being moved by 2 members of his own team toward an extraction point that never got the call to come get him. Which 2 members? She said, voice very quiet now. Marsh met her eyes. One of them was Victor Lassiter. The room tilted, because that meant Victor hadn't just faked his own death and let her family grieve a lie. He'd been there. At the end, whatever the end actually was, he'd had her father wounded in his hands at the exact moment history decided to erase them both. And the second, she said. Who was the second man? Marsh hesitated, just long enough for her to know the answer was going to cost him something to say. Foster Grimshaw, he said. Civilian oversight, attached to the operation, Department of Defense liaison. He wasn't even supposed to be in the field that night, but he was. Who is he now? Now he's a name on committee letterhead in Washington, Marsh said. Advisor, consultant. The kind of man who's spent 2 decades making sure nobody ever asks the questions you're asking right now. Wren sat down slowly, because her legs had quite suddenly stopped being entirely reliable. So the report, she said, the one that said my father was presumed dead, was written to close a door, Marsh said. Fast, clean, before anyone above a certain pay grade had to explain what really happened out there, or why American ordnance was moving through a channel it should never have touched. And nobody ever went back for him. I don't know, Marsh said, and this time the honesty in it hurt worse than a lie would have, because
At least a lie could be argued with. I've spent 17 years wondering the same thing, Wren. I was a junior officer, 3 ranks too green to stop any of it. I've carried that a long time. She stared at the table, at the dust ring left by a coffee cup someone had abandoned years ago. My mother waited by a window for 17 years, she said, for a man that 2 people who both stood at his funeral might have had the answer to the whole time. I know. And you're telling me this now because whoever leaked our position today, Marsh said, knew things only a handful of people are supposed to know. Which means this isn't just about Lassiter running a chop shop for stolen ordnance anymore. This is about somebody protecting a 17-year-old cover-up that's still very much alive. Wren looked up. Grimshaw, she said. Marsh didn't answer, didn't need to. His silence said it plainly enough. So this whole time, she said, you weren't just hunting a weapons pipeline. No, you were hunting whoever's been protecting it for 2 decades. Close enough. Long enough anyway that it hasn't mattered whether the number was exactly right. And you brought me in because you're the only person alive who has a reason to want the truth more than your own career, or your own clearance, or your own neck, Marsh said. Everyone else in this fight has something to lose by finding it. You've got nothing left to lose. You already lost it all 17 years ago. She sat with that a long moment, let it settle into the same place where every miss her father ever taught her to remember still lived. Then let's find it, she said. Marsh nodded once, slow, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with rank or mission or the 17 years of silence that had brought them to this dusty farmhouse kitchen. It was closer to an understanding 2 people who'd both lost pieces of themselves to the same cover-up, choosing, in that quiet moment, to finish tearing it down together. There's a risk in this, he said, a real one. If we're right about Grimshaw, we're not just up against Lassiter's men anymore. We're up against the machinery of an institution that's had 17 years to practice making inconvenient people disappear. I know. I need you to understand that before we go any further. This isn't a rescue mission with a clean ending guaranteed. People we care about could still get hurt. You could still get hurt. Wren thought of her mother in that rocking chair, gray and thin and fixed on a window that never once delivered what she was watching for. Thought of 17 years spent flinching at every truck that came up the driveway, hoping and dreading in the same breath. I already know what happens if we don't try, she said. I lived inside it my whole life. I'd rather take the risk than spend 1 more year not knowing. Marsh held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded, the decision settling into place between them like something finally, permanently sealed. The farmhouse held them for the rest of that night. Hollis moved between the 2 wounded operators with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd done this in worse conditions than a dusty kitchen with 1 working lamp. And Wren found herself standing in the doorway of the room where they'd laid the injured men out, watching the medic work, unable to make herself walk away. One of the wounded, a young operator named Petrov, who couldn't have been older than 24, caught her watching and managed a thin, pained smile. Heard you cleared the loading bay, he said, voice tight around the pain. 2 shots, 600 yards. Doss won't shut up about it. Doss talks a lot. Doss talks constantly, Petrov agreed. Doesn't make him wrong, though. He winced as Hollis adjusted the dressing on his leg, breath hissing through his teeth. My grandfather served with a Calloway once. Different one, maybe, or maybe not so different. Said the name meant something back in his day. Guess it still does. Wren didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just nodded and let the silence hold the weight neither of them had words for. She thought about her father then in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with legacy. The strange, unasked-for inheritance of a name that meant something to strangers before it ever fully belonged to her. She hadn't chosen this weight. She'd been born into it, the way some people were born into money or debt. A family ledger she hadn't signed but was somehow still expected to settle. She was starting to understand that she didn't mind settling it. Not anymore. Doss found her outside a while later, sitting on the porch steps of the farmhouse in the dark, watching the last of the adrenaline drain out of her hands, one slow shake at a time. "You did good today," he said, sitting down beside her without asking, the same way Cole had claimed the empty cot without asking. Something about seals, she was learning, that made permission feel optional once trust had been earned. "I froze," she said, "for a second, when I had him in my sights." "Didn't look like freezing from where I was standing." "It was. I had the shot. I didn't take it." Doss was quiet a moment, looking out at the dark tree line, the same tree line that had nearly gotten them all killed a few hours earlier. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think a person who could shoot her own uncle without hesitating is a person I wouldn't trust with a rifle in the first place. Hesitation's not the same as failure, Calloway. Sometimes it's just proof you're still whole enough to feel something." She looked over at him, surprised by the gentleness in it, coming from a man who 12 hours earlier had told her to her face that bringing her along was a mistake. "Careful, Doss," she said. Almost sounded like a compliment. "Don't let it go to your head." He was quiet a moment, turning something over. "I said this was a mistake back at the briefing. I want to take that back if it's not too late." "It's not." "Good. Because I've served with plenty of men who wouldn't have made that call today. Full trigger discipline under fire on a target that used to sit at your family's dinner table. That's not something they teach in a training pipeline. That's something a person either has or doesn't." "My father had it," she said. "I guess some of it passed down whether I asked for it or not." "Guess it did." He stood, brushed off his pants, offered her a hand up. She didn't entirely need, but took anyway. "Get some rest. Whatever's coming next, it's not going to wait for either of us to feel ready." He was right, though neither of them knew yet just how soon or how badly that next thing was coming. The intelligence had come in overnight, relayed through a channel Marsh trusted only slightly more than the one that had gotten them ambushed 2 days earlier. A source inside Lassiter's supply network, someone Reyes Pratt had been quietly cultivating for months, feeding back just enough detail to be useful without ever revealing enough to be verified. "I don't like it," Doss said, studying the new map spread across the farmhouse table. 2 days ago, we had solid intel and still walked into an ambush. Now we're supposed to trust intel from a source we've never even confirmed exists? "We don't have the luxury of certainty," Marsh said. "Lassiter knows we're close. Every day we wait, he gets more time to disappear entirely, and Wren's father goes with him. You don't know her father's even part of this anymore." "I don't know that he isn't," Marsh said, flat, final. "And until I do, I'm not sitting on my hands." Wren said nothing, studying the topography of the pass instead, the narrow throat of rock that gave the ambush point its name. The sheer walls on either side that would turn any convoy moving through it into something trapped the moment trouble found them. "Widow's Cut," she said. Whoever named it wasn't being subtle. "Old mining road," Reyes Pratt offered, not looking up from his laptop. "Local legend says a coal company ran supply trucks through there back in the day, before the mine collapsed. Killed enough men that the wives started calling it that themselves. Been called that on maps for the better part of a century." "Comforting," Doss muttered. "It's a good ambush point," Wren said. "For them or for us. Whoever gets there first with the high ground wins." Marsh looked at her a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. "You've got a read on this." "I've got a read on terrain. That's all my father ever taught me to trust." She traced a finger along the ridgeline above the pass on the map. "If I'm running 6 trucks through a bottleneck like that, I've got shooters posted above it before the first truck ever enters. Question is how many and how far back they're staged." "Which we won't know until we're already in it," Doss said. "Which is why I go up first," Wren said. "Before the convoy, get eyes on the ridge before anyone commits to that pass." Marsh studied the map another long moment, weighing a decision that had already cost them blood once this week and could easily cost them more. "All right," he said finally. "We do it your way, but this time nobody moves until you've confirmed the ridge clean. I don't care how tight the window is." "Copy that," Wren said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in the last 17 years.
She should have felt something about that name. Didn't have time to. The team moved into position before dawn. Wren on overwatch again, this time closer, only 300 yards out, tucked into a rock shelf above the pass where the trucks were supposed to run through at first light. Except "supposed to" was a phrase that had betrayed her twice already this week. Movement, Cole's voice tight through the earpiece. Multiple vehicles. That's not 2 trucks, that's 6. Wren swung the scope down the pass, counted, confirmed. 6, she said. Confirmed 6. This isn't a shipment, this is an army. Copy that. All elements hold position, do not engage. Repeat, do not. The first RPG round hit the tree line 40 yards from Marsh's position before he finished the sentence. Everything after that stopped being a plan and started being chaos. Wren's whole body went into a place beyond thought. Scope, down, rifle, steady, target, breathe, fire, cycle, target, breathe, fire, cycle. The rhythm her father had built into her bones since she was 9 years old with a rifle too heavy for her hands.
Because this was what it was for. All of it. Every missed can on a fence post, every cold morning on the lake, every lesson delivered in a voice that never once raised itself in anger. This exact moment. Below her, Marsh's team scattered for cover as fire poured in from at least 8 positions, more men than intelligence had estimated, more firepower than 6 trucks should have carried.
They knew! Doss shouted, ducking behind the rock shelf beside her, blood already running from a graze along his jaw. They knew we were coming! Again! Focus, Wren snapped. Targets first, questions later. She found a shooter with a rocket launcher, reloading behind a boulder, fired. He dropped before he finished the motion. Found another, fired, dropped, until her scope swept across a face that stopped her cold. Victor. Standing in the open at the mouth of the pass, directing fire like a general who'd never once doubted his own survival. Her finger hovered on the trigger. Because she had the shot. Clean, clear, 300 yards, no wind worth mentioning, the easiest kill of the entire operation sitting right there in her crosshairs. And she couldn't pull it. Not because her hands shook, they didn't. Because something underneath her hands did. Take the shot, Doss shouted. Calloway, take the shot! Until a scream tore through the radio. Not Doss's voice, not Cole's. Marsh's. And it wasn't the sound of a man giving orders anymore. It was the sound of a man who'd just watched something go badly, terribly wrong. The transmission cut to static. Wren didn't decide to move. Her body simply moved the rifle, abandoned the pistol in her hand, sliding down the rock shelf toward the tree line before any rational thought had time to argue with the decision. Calloway, what are you doing? Get back to position! She didn't answer. Couldn't, because answering would have taken breath she needed for running. She broke through the tree line into a scene that looked like something out of a war she'd only ever heard about secondhand. Marsh, down on one knee, dragging a wounded operator by the strap of his vest, 3 shooters closing from the flank with weapons already raised, and no cover between them and the end of everything. She didn't think. She threw herself into the gap. The first round caught her in the shoulder, spun her half around, and the pain that followed wasn't pain so much as a white detonation that swallowed her whole vision for one long, terrible second. She didn't go down. The second round caught her in the side below the vest line, and this time her knees did buckle, did threaten to fold her straight into the dirt. She didn't let them. Because behind her, Marsh was still dragging a wounded man toward cover, still exposed, still 3 full seconds from safety, and 3 seconds was exactly the amount of time 3 shooters needed to finish what they started. So she planted her feet, raised the pistol with an arm that no longer felt entirely like it belonged to her body, and put down the nearest shooter with 2 rounds that came from somewhere far past pain, from someplace her father had built in her decades before she ever needed it. The third round caught her high in the chest, just above the vest's edge, and this time the whole world tilted sideways and didn't come back. She heard herself hit the ground before she felt it. Heard Doss screaming her name from somewhere very far away, heard boots pounding through underbrush, heard Marsh's voice cracking in a way she'd never once heard a man like that allow it to crack. Calloway, stay with me. Stay with me. Do you hear me? That's an order. Not Navy, she tried to say. Wasn't sure any sound came out at all. Don't have to. Follow your orders. Darkness pressed in from every edge of her vision, patient the way fog on a lake is patient, the way waiting is patient, the way 17 years of a woman sitting in a rocking chair by a window is patient. Until the last thing she saw before everything went black was Marsh's face above hers. Furious. Terrified. Alive because she'd made sure of it. She saved us, she heard him say to someone, to everyone, to the whole ravine full of smoke and blood and men who'd underestimated her a week ago and would never make that mistake again. She saved the whole team. Somewhere in the dark, her father's voice found her one more time. That's the one you'll remember, Rennie, not the missus, that. And then there was nothing at all. The last thing her mind offered her before the dark closed in completely was the smell of pine and gun oil and a snow-covered fence post and a 9-year-old girl who never once imagined this was where all of it would lead. Later, much later, Doss would tell it a different way to anyone who'd listen in the mess hall, in the barracks, in bars 3 states away, where nobody could verify a word of it, and everybody believed him anyway. He'd say a 110-pound woman with a dead man's aim and a live wire's nerve walked into the worst 30 seconds of his career and turned it into the reason 6 men got to write letters home instead of having letters written about them. He'd say it like it was a legend because by the time the story finished traveling from one barracks to another, it had started to become one. But in the moment itself, in the actual dirt and smoke and blood of Widow's Cut, there had been no legend. Only a woman who'd spent her whole life learning to hold still when everything in her wanted to run, and who finally, in the one moment that mattered most, chose to run toward the danger instead of away from it. Nobody in that ravine would ever fully explain why. Not even Wren, not for a long time yet. But somewhere underneath the pain and the darkness closing in, she already knew the truth of it, even if she couldn't have said it out loud. She hadn't thrown herself into that gap to save 6 strangers in uniform. She'd thrown herself into it because somewhere, 17 years ago, her father had done the exact same thing for men who never got the chance to thank him for it. And some debts, she was beginning to understand, don't get paid by the person who incurred them. They get paid by whoever's left standing close enough to settle the account. Marsh rode in the medevac helicopter with her one hand pressed flat against the field dressing on her chest the entire flight, not because the pressure was doing much good anymore, but because he needed his hands to be doing something other than shaking. He kept talking to her the whole way, low and steady, a stream of words she'd only half remember, later stories about her father, fragments of missions from 20 years back, anything he could think to say to keep her tethered to the sound of a human voice while the helicopter cut through the dark toward the nearest trauma center. He told her later that he didn't remember most of what he'd said either, only that he'd been terrified of the silence that would follow if he stopped. Doss and Cole rode in the second bird with the 2 other wounded operators, none of them speaking much, all of them replaying the same handful of seconds over and over, the moment a small woman with a rifle bigger than her own convictions had planted her feet in a gap none of them could have covered fast enough, and simply refused to move. Somewhere over the dark spine of the Appalachians, Doss finally broke the silence. Her old man would have been proud, he said to no one in particular, to all of them at once. Cole didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice carried something none of them had heard from him before. Not quite grief, not quite awe, something suspended in the narrow space between the two. Her old man's the reason she knew how, he said. Proud doesn't half cover it. Below them, the mountains kept their silence the way mountains always do, holding whatever secrets they held about the 17 years that had led to this exact night about a wounded woman bleeding out over West Virginia ridgelines that had already taken so much from her family and were, for now, still deciding whether to take any more. The helicopter carried her east, toward lights and surgeons and a hospital bed she wouldn't wake up in for 4 days. But somewhere in that same darkness, though none of them could have known it yet, a message was already moving through channels far quieter than any radio frequency Marsh's team monitored. Word traveling from a compromised compound in the Appalachian foothills to a man in Washington who'd spent 17 years believing his secret was finally
permanently safe.
It wasn't anymore.
And 300 miles away in a cell nobody official would admit to operating, a man who hadn't heard a voice from the outside world in longer than he could accurately measure lifted his head at a sound he hadn't expected to ever hear again, the distant, unmistakable rhythm of a helicopter passing somewhere far overhead, carrying, though he had no way of knowing it yet, the daughter he'd taught to hold her breath between heartbeats on a snowy Montana morning that felt now like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. White ceiling, white walls, a machine somewhere beeping in a rhythm that had nothing to do with her own heartbeat except apparently that steady green line was hers. Wren opened her eyes to fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and a weight in her chest that felt like someone had parked a truck on her ribs and left it running. 3 gunshot wounds, shoulder, side, high chest, just above the vest line, close enough to something vital that the surgeon who'd stitched her back together kept using the word miracle like it was a medical term. It wasn't a miracle. It was geometry. A few inches either direction and this room would have been empty instead of occupied. She didn't feel lucky. She felt tired in a way sleep hadn't touched in 26 years. Somewhere in the fog of the last 4 days, fragments surfaced when she let her mind go quiet enough to find them. The helicopter blades, Marsh's voice low and constant, a lifeline made of sound, a surgeon's face leaning over her saying words she couldn't hold on to. And underneath all of it, strange and persistent, the sense that something had shifted in the world while she'd been unconscious, not just in her body, but somewhere farther out past the hospital walls, past the mountains, in a cell she hadn't seen yet, but somehow already knew existed. She'd dreamed of her father twice in whatever half-conscious state the medication had kept her suspended in. Not memories, exactly. Something closer to a conversation, fragmented and strange him, telling her to hold still, to breathe halfway, to trust the wind before she trusted her own eyes. She'd woken from the second dream, convinced with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence that wherever he was still breathing. She'd been right. She just hadn't known it yet. "You're awake," Marsh, sitting in a chair beside the bed that looked too small for him, arms still bandaged from the ravine, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't left that chair since they wheeled her in. "How long?" she rasped. 4 days. "The team alive, because of you." His jaw worked. "Cole took shrapnel. He'll walk it off. Doss won't stop talking about you, which honestly might be worse than the shrapnel. Petrov's out of surgery, resting. Everybody's accounted for. Everybody's breathing." She almost laughed. It hurt too much to finish the motion. "Victor," she said instead. Marsh's face changed, went careful, the way it always went careful right before he told her something that was going to cost her. "We took him," he said, "alive. He didn't run after the ravine, almost like he wanted to be caught." Her chest tightened, not from the wound. "I want to see him, Wren. I want to see him." Her voice cracked on the second try, but the words came out steady enough to matter. "You owe me that much. Everyone in this whole operation has owed me something for 17 years. Start paying it down." Marsh looked at her a long moment, then nodded slow like a man agreeing to something he already knew he couldn't stop. 2 days, he said, when you can sit up without the monitors screaming. He hesitated at the door before he left, like there was one more thing he wanted to say and hadn't found the shape of it yet. "Earl Danby's been calling the base every day," he said finally, "wanting news. Wouldn't say much to anyone but you. We finally let him through on a secure line yesterday in case you didn't make it, and he needed to hear it from someone who'd actually been there." Something in her chest loosened just slightly at the sound of that name. "What did he say?" "That he wasn't surprised. Said something about Calloway never doing anything the easy way." Marsh's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "He asked me to tell you when you woke up that your mother would have been proud of the trouble you're causing." Wren closed her eyes, and for a moment the hospital room blurred at the edges. Not from pain this time, but from something warmer and harder to name. "Tell him I said thank you," she said, "for the folder.
for not letting it stay buried. I will.
Doss and Cole came by that same afternoon, still in civilian clothes, still carrying themselves with the loose, careful gait of men whose bodies were healing on the same timeline as hers. Doss brought a bag of sunflower seeds from the base commissary of all things and dropped them on her tray table like an offering.
Figured you'd be sick of hospital jello by now, he said.
You figured right.
Cole hung back near the doorway, quieter than usual until Doss elbowed him forward.
Go on. Tell her what you told me.
Cole shifted his weight, uncomfortable, in a way that looked almost boyish on a man built like a doorframe.
I owe you an apology, he said.
First day in the briefing room. I didn't say anything out loud, but I was thinking the same thing Doss said before he said it. Figured you were a liability.
And now?
Now I've got a daughter of my own back home, Cole said. 4 years old. And I keep thinking about what it must have cost you, growing up the way you did. Waiting the way your mother waited. And then walking straight into the thing that took your father on purpose with your eyes open. He shook his head slow. I don't know many people who'd have that kind of nerve. I'm glad I was wrong about you.
Wren felt something tighten in her throat that had nothing to do with the wound in her chest.
Thank you, she managed, both of you, for today, for the ravine, for not writing me off after that first briefing.
Don't get soft on us, Calloway, Doss said, though his voice had gone rougher than his words let on. We've still got work to finish.
Wouldn't dream of it,
she said, and meant it the same way Marsh had meant it days earlier, standing in a different gray room at the start of all this.
The physical therapist who came by that morning to assess her range of motion took one look at the determination on her face and simply handed her the walker without argument, the way people learned to do around Wren Calloway once they'd been around her more than a day.
Small steps, the woman said. You tear a stitch, you set yourself back a week.
Your call. Understood.
She made it 4 laps around the ward before her legs gave her the truth her pride didn't want to hear, and she sat heavily in a chair by the window, breathing hard, sweat cold on her back, despite the effort costing her almost nothing compared to what her body had survived 4 days earlier.
Through the window, Bethesda spread out gray and ordinary under an overcast sky. Cars moving through intersections, people living lives that had never once been touched by a folder full of photographs that shouldn't exist. She watched them a long while, envying them in a distant, unbothered way, the way you envy weather in a country you'll never visit. She thought about her mother again, about the particular kind of stubbornness it took to sit in one chair for 17 years refusing to move even when everyone around her insisted the waiting was pointless. She'd always thought of that stubbornness as a kind of surrender, a woman letting grief calcify into habit. She understood it differently now, sitting in this hospital chair with 3 healing bullet wounds and a walker she refused to fully lean on. Her mother hadn't been surrendering. She'd been standing guard, keeping a post nobody else believed was still worth keeping. Wren finally understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water that she'd inherited more from Eleanor Calloway than she'd ever given her mother credit for. They wheeled her down a corridor 2 floors below the hospital ward 2 days later into a section of the building that didn't officially exist on any directory. A room with a table bolted to the floor, a chair on either side also bolted, and Victor Lassiter, wrists cuffed to the table, looking smaller than he had 600 yards away through a rifle scope. He looked up when she rolled in. Something moved across his face, not fear, not defiance, something closer to grief, old and complicated, the kind that had clearly been waiting a very long time for somewhere to land. For a moment before either of them spoke, Wren let herself simply look at him, really look, the way she hadn't allowed herself to at 600 yards through a scope, or in the chaos of the ravine, or in any of the fragmented, adrenaline-soaked moments since Marsh had first slid his photograph across a gray table in Norfolk. Up close, the years showed differently than they had in surveillance photos. Not just older, worn down in a particular way, the way a stone gets worn by water it never asked to carry. Whatever life Victor Lassiter had built for himself in the shadows, it hadn't been an easy one. It had cost him something visible, something she could see now,
sitting 3 feet away in a way she hadn't been able to from a mountain ridge. "Rennie Bird," he said, quiet. "Don't!" Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, or exactly as sharp as she meant it to. She wasn't sure anymore. "You don't get to call me that." "No," he agreed. "I don't." Silence. The fluorescent light hummed the same off-key note it always hummed in rooms like this. Like every government building in the country was wired by the same tired electrician. "My mother waited by a window for 17 years, she said. You stood at a funeral for a coffin you knew was empty. I know. You cried, Victor. I remember. I was 7 years old and I remember you crying harder than my own mother. I know." His voice cracked on the word. Genuinely, or close enough to genuine that she almost couldn't tell the difference anymore, and hating that she couldn't tell was its own kind of wound. "Because some of those tears were real, Wren. That's the part nobody's going to believe. But they were." "Then explain it to me." She leaned forward, every stitched wound in her body screaming at the motion, and didn't care. "Explain how you cried real tears over a lie you built with your own hands." He was quiet, a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because I didn't build it," he said finally. "I inherited it." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." "Then give me the whole thing," she said. "Every piece. I've earned it. I bled for it 4 days ago in a ravine you sent an army into." Something in his face broke open at that. Actual pain, or something close enough to matter. "That wasn't supposed to happen," he said. "The ravine? I wasn't running that op anymore, not really, not by the end. Somebody above me changed the plan, added men, added weapons. I found out the same morning you did." "Somebody above you?" "There's always somebody above you," Victor said. "That's the whole rotten architecture of it. I thought I was running a smuggling operation to keep old debts quiet. Turns out I was running it for somebody who needed those debts to stay buried a lot deeper than I ever understood." Wren's pulse picked up. "Whose debts?" Victor looked at her, and in his eyes for just a moment she saw the man who used to catch her off the dock. The man who taught her to whittle. The man who'd apparently spent 17 years being slowly consumed by something he never had the strength to refuse. "Your father found something he wasn't supposed to find," he said. 17 years ago. A shipment. Off the books. He and I both saw it. Both reported it up the chain because that's what you do, that's what we were trained to do. And the chain reported back with orders to make the whole operation disappear. Us included, if it came to that. Victor's hands, cuffed to the table, curled into loose fists. "There was a firefight. Wrong uniforms. Your father took 3 rounds trying to get us both out. I got him half a mile before—" He stopped. "Before what?" Wren said, barely a whisper now. "Before a helicopter that wasn't ours found us first," Victor said. "Extraction, they told me. Just not the kind either of us expected. They took him, told me he didn't make it. Told me if I ever said different, they'd make sure it was true retroactively, my family, my record, everything gone, like it never existed." The room tilted. Wren gripped the edge of the bolted table to keep herself upright. "So you let us bury an empty box," she said. "I let myself believe he was already dead," Victor said, "for a long time. I told myself that lie so many times it started fitting like truth. Until 3 years ago." "What happened 3 years ago?" "I got proof he wasn't." The whole room seemed to stop breathing. "He's alive," Wren said. Not a question, a demand dressed up as one, because some part of her needed him to argue with it, and he didn't. "He was," Victor said, 3 years ago. "Held somewhere they don't officially operate anymore. I've spent 3 years running that pipeline, moving weapons. I hate moving, keeping men like Foster Grimshaw satisfied enough that they wouldn't finish what they started 17 years ago. The name detonated in her chest. "Grimshaw," she said. "He's the one who built the whole architecture," Victor said. "The cover-up, the presumption of death, the disappearing act. He's spent 2 decades protecting a secret that would end him, end his career, his freedom, maybe worse, if it ever surfaced. Your father's the last living piece of evidence that could sink him. Which means, as long as your father's alive, Victor said, Grimshaw's not safe.
And as long as I kept moving weapons for him, your father stayed alive. That was the whole rotten deal I made with myself. Keep supplying him, keep Silas breathing, wait for a chance to end it clean. Wren stared at him. 17 years of grief and fury and confusion collapsing down into one single desperate question. "Is he still alive?" she said. "Right now. Today." Victor met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd walked into that room, something like hope moved behind his own. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't had contact in 6 weeks. But I know where they were keeping him. If Grimshaw hasn't moved him, He stopped himself, started again, quieter. "If he's still there, Wren, I can take you to him." "You heard," she said, not a question. "Every word. Two-way glass." Marsh's face had gone the color of old paper. "Wren, if this is true, it's true." She didn't know how she knew, she just did. 26 years of trusting her instincts at 300 yards had taught her when a target was real and when it was a trick of the light. "My father's alive, and a man named Foster Grimshaw has spent 17 years making sure nobody found that out. Grimshaw is not some low-level contractor," Marsh said, low, urgent, glancing down the hall, like the walls themselves might be listening. "He's a senior defense advisor. He's got access, connections, decades of institutional cover. Going after him isn't like going after Lassiter's compound." "I don't care." "You should care. This isn't a mountain full of crates and hired guns anymore. This is the machine itself." "Then we take apart the machine," Wren said, flat, certain. The same voice she used to call a wind adjustment, the same voice that never asked permission to be right. "My mother spent 17 years dying next to a window because that machine needed a lie to stay quiet. I'm done letting it stay quiet." Marsh studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not doubt anymore, something closer to resolve, catching hers the way fire catches from one branch to the next. "Then we do this properly," he said. "Quietly. Nobody tips Grimshaw before we know where your father actually is. One leak already got 6 of my men shot in a ravine. I'm not risking a second." "Agreed. You're not cleared for field work. You've got 3 healing gunshot wounds and a surgeon who'll have my rank for even letting you stand up." "Try and stop me," Wren said. Marsh almost smiled. Almost. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. "Get some rest, Calloway. We move in 72 hours. And this time, we bring everyone." He paused halfway down the hall and turned back. "One more thing. Danby called again this morning, asked if he could come along." Wren's chest tightened around something unexpected, gratitude maybe, or the particular relief of learning that a debt she'd worried about never repaying was already quietly being settled by the person who'd started this whole chain of events. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to be at the staging point in 72 hours. Marsh said. "Figured, after everything he's done to get us here, he's earned the right to see how it ends." Victor led them in, wrists no longer cuffed, but a naval escort walked a half-step behind him the entire way because trust in this particular story had run out of easy versions to hand out. Wren walked with her side still bandaged, tight beneath her vest, every step sending a dull ache through healing muscle, and she didn't care, not even slightly. Because somewhere past that chain-link fence, if Victor was right, if the universe had one shred of mercy left to spend on her family, her father was still breathing. Earl Danby stood near the tree line as they staged, arms crossed, gray buzz cut catching the last of the afternoon light, watching the facility with the particular stillness of a man who'd waited a long time for a moment he wasn't sure would ever come. "Didn't think I'd see this day," he said when Wren came to stand beside him. "Didn't think I'd get here without you," she said. "That folder, the bar in Missoula, none of this happens if you don't hand it to me." "I almost didn't," Danby admitted. "Sat outside that bar for 20 minutes before I worked up the nerve to walk in. Kept telling myself I was an old fool chasing a feeling I couldn't prove." He looked at her, something raw moving behind his eyes. Your mother's the reason I finally did it, if I'm honest. Kept thinking about those Christmas cards. Kept thinking she deserved better than an old man too scared to hand over what he knew.
She would have liked you for it, Wren said. She kept every one of your letters, you know, even the ones you stopped sending. Danby's jaw worked, and for a moment he looked like he might not trust his own voice.
I've got a debt to your family I've been carrying 17 years too long, he said finally. Figured today's as good a day as any to start paying it down.
2 guards, Doss murmured from nearby scope trained on the facility's side entrance.
Maybe 3 inside.
Grimshaw doesn't need an army, Victor said quietly. He needs silence. Silence doesn't take many hands. They moved in at dusk, fast, coordinated, the kind of operation that looked from a distance almost gentle compared to the chaos of the ravine, because this time nobody wanted noise.
Noise meant a chance for someone inside to make a decision they couldn't take back.
Wren stayed close to Marsh, sidearm drawn, heart hammering against healing ribs hard enough to hurt. They cleared the entrance, cleared a corridor lined with fluorescent lights just as tired and off-key as every government hallway she'd walked through this entire ordeal. Cleared a guard station, empty coffee still warm in a cup on the desk. And then they reached a door at the end of the hall, reinforced, a small observation window cut into the steel. Wren looked through it before anyone could stop her. A room, small, spare, a cot against the wall, and a man sitting on the edge of it. Older than the photograph in her mother's dresser drawer, grayer, thinner in a way that made her chest cave in on itself. But the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man who'd spent a lifetime being still on purpose, that hadn't changed at all. Her knees nearly gave out. "Dad!" The word came out of her before she'd decided to say it, cracked wide open, 26 years compressed into 2 syllables. The man on the cot looked up.
For one horrible second, his eyes were empty.
Dulled by years she couldn't imagine, by a kind of isolation that hollows a person out from the inside, no matter how strong they started. And then something in his face changed. "Wren," his voice, rough from disuse, cracked at the edges, but hers, unmistakably hers, the same voice that had taught her to hold her breath between heartbeats on a cold Montana morning 19 years ago. Marsh cut the lock. The door swung open. She crossed the room before her body finished deciding to move, and then she was on her knees in front of the cot, and her father's arms, thinner than she remembered, but still strong enough, still there, still real, closed around her, like 17 years hadn't happened at all. "You're supposed to be dead," she said into his shoulder, sobbing now, no longer able or willing to hold any of it back. "We buried you. Mom waited. She waited every single day, and you were—" "I know," he said, voice breaking. "I know, Rennie. I know. She's gone, Dad. She died waiting for you in March, in her chair, looking out the window like you were going to come up the driveway any minute." Silence. The terrible, grief-soaked silence, and she felt her father's whole body shudder against her. A grown man, a legend, a myth in a folded flag breaking apart in real time over a loss he'd had no chance to prepare for. "I tried," he said so quiet she almost missed it. "Every day. I tried to find a way back to both of you. I know. I'm sorry. I know," she said again, because there was nothing else true enough to say. They didn't have long to grieve together. Grief in this story was a luxury that came with a time limit. "Movement outside," Cole's voice crackled through the radio, tense. "Vehicle approaching the front gate. Government plates." Marsh's face went hard. "Grimshaw." "How would he know?" Wren said, pulling back from her father, wiping her face with the back of a hand, still bandaged from the ravine. "Because somebody's still talking," Marsh said. "Same as before. Same leak or a new one. Doesn't matter which. We need to move, now." Silas Calloway rose from the cot slowly, joints stiff from years of confinement, and something in his eyes sharpened despite it. The old instinct still alive under all that rust, still waiting for exactly this moment.
"Give me a weapon," he said.
"Sir, with respect, you're in no condition—"
"Give me a weapon," he said again. Quiet. Absolute. The same tone Wren had heard him use exactly once in her childhood, right before he took down a rattlesnake 6 feet from where she stood, without so much as raising his voice. Doss handed over a sidearm without another word of argument. They moved as a unit toward the facility's main hall, Wren at her father's side for the first time in 17 years, both of them armed, both of them ready, both of them carrying the exact same fury, dressed in 2 different decades of grief. The main doors burst open before they reached them. Foster Grimshaw walked in, flanked by 4 armed men in unmarked tactical gear. 60s, silver hair combed with the kind of precision that spoke to a man who'd never once in his life let anything look unplanned. A face built for committee rooms, not battlefields, except his eyes carried the particular coldness of a man who'd sent other people to fight his wars for 2 decades running. "Master Chief Calloway," he said, almost warmly, like they were old colleagues meeting for lunch instead of standing on opposite sides of a 17-year crime. "You do have a stubborn habit of surviving." "Grimshaw," her father's voice, low, dangerous, 17 years of rage compressed into a single syllable. "And you must be the daughter." Grimshaw's gaze slid to Wren, assessing, cold. "The one who's been making my last 2 weeks so remarkably difficult." "You buried a lie for 17 years, Wren said. "You let my mother die waiting for a man you kept in a cell 40 miles from where I grew up." "I did what the situation required," Grimshaw said, flat, unbothered. The tone of a man who'd long ago stopped losing sleep over collateral damage that wasn't his own. "Your father found something inconvenient. Inconvenient things require management." "Management," Silas repeated. Something in his voice had gone very quiet, very still. The stillness right before a shot breaks. "You were a soldier," Grimshaw said. "You understand sacrifice for the greater good." "I understand a coward hiding behind a title," Silas said. "I understand a man who sent boys to die for a shipment he was skimming off the top." Grimshaw's jaw tightened just slightly, the first crack in that polished composure. "It doesn't have to end badly," he said, glancing at his men, at the numbers stacked in his favor, 4 armed against a wounded operator, an old soldier, and a handful of SEALs who'd already bled once this week. "I can make all of this disappear. Again." "I've done it before." "Not this time," Marsh said, stepping forward, weapon steady, despite the bandage still wrapped around his own arm. "This time, there's a hospital record, a rescued POW, 6 SEALs as witnesses. You can't disappear all of it, Grimshaw, not anymore." Something shifted in Grimshaw's face, the first real flicker of fear buried under decades of practiced calm, but there, unmistakably there. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, "we're at an impasse." His men raised their weapons, so did everyone else in the room. For one long suspended second, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The whole hallway held its collective breath the way a rifle holds a shot right before the trigger breaks, until Victor stepped forward, unarmed, hands raised, slow, deliberate. "Foster," he said, quiet. "It's over. You know it's over. The only question left is how many more people bleed before you accept that." "Step back, Victor," Grimshaw said. "This doesn't concern you anymore." "It's concerned me for 17 years, Victor said. "I just didn't have the spine to end it until now." He kept walking, slow, steady, directly into the space between Grimshaw's men and the people they were aiming at. "Victor," Wren started. "Let me finish this," he said, not looking back. "Let me do one thing right." Grimshaw's nearest guard hesitated, weapon wavering, uncertain whether an unarmed man walking calmly toward him constituted a threat worth the trigger pull. That hesitation was all Marsh needed. The SEALs moved as one, weapons up, voices sharp, commanding, drowning out whatever Grimshaw tried to say next. 2 of his men dropped their weapons on command, hands rising fast, self-preservation outweighing loyalty. The second, the odds flipped. The third didn't. raised his weapon toward Marsh instead, and Wren's body moved before her mind finished the calculation. Weapon up, breath held, the same rhythm her father built into her decades ago on a cold morning she'd never once stopped carrying.
She fired once. He went down.
Grimshaw stood alone now, his last loyal guard disarmed and kneeling, his whole carefully constructed empire collapsing in the space of about 11 seconds. "You can't prove any of this," he said, voice cracking despite the words. 17 years of paperwork. Nobody's going to unravel that. "We don't need to unravel paperwork," Silas said, stepping forward, weapons steady, eyes cold, in a way Wren had never once seen from her father in her entire childhood. "We've got you, standing right here, confessing in front of 6 witnesses and my daughter." Grimshaw's face went pale. "Cuff him," Marsh said. For a moment, nobody moved. The adrenaline that had carried them through the last 90 seconds hadn't finished draining out of the room, and everyone stood there, a beat too long, breathing hard, checking each other for wounds out of pure reflex before anyone remembered to actually secure the prisoner still standing in front of them.
"Sir," one of the younger SEALs finally said, stepping forward to take Grimshaw's arm, "you're under arrest under federal statute for conspiracy, obstruction, and unlawful detention of United States service member. You have the right to remain silent."
Grimshaw said nothing as they cuffed him. Whatever composure he'd built across 2 decades of quiet, careful power had finally, completely run out. Earl Danby, who'd hung back near the entrance for the entirety of the confrontation, weapon never once raised, stepped forward now to help 2 of the SEALs secure Grimshaw's hands, and there was something quietly fitting about it, Wren thought. The man who'd started this whole unraveling, getting to be the one who helped close the loop. 17 years and 1 folder later.
"Wasn't sure I'd live to see this," Danby said low, mostly to himself.
"None of us were," Silas said, and for the first time since Wren had found him on that cot, something that almost resembled a smile crossed her father's face. "Good to see you again, old friend. Good to see you breathing, Master Chief." Fog on the water again, low and gray and patient the way it always was in the mornings, the way it had been the very first morning of this whole impossible story. Except this time there were 2 chairs on the porch. Silas Calloway sat in one, a blanket over his knees despite the mild autumn air, still healing, still thinner than the photographs but present. Real, breathing, here. Wren sat beside him, coffee in hand, her shoulders still stiff from the wound, her ribs still aching if she twisted the wrong way, small permanent souvenirs of a ravine 600 miles from this porch. "She used to sit right there," her father said quietly, nodding at the rocking chair just inside the window. "Every morning." "I know," Wren said. "I watched her do it for 17 years. He was quiet a long moment, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than words could hold. "I should have found a way back sooner," he said. "You didn't have a way back," Wren said. "That's not the same as not trying. Doesn't feel different some mornings." "I know," she said, "but it is." They sat with that, watched the fog lift slow off the water the way it always did, revealing the mountains, one gray shoulder at a time. "Victor's testifying," her father said eventually. "Full cooperation. Might keep him out of a life sentence. Might not. Do you forgive him?" Silas considered the question a long time before answering, the way he'd always considered everything, weighing it, the way he used to weigh wind before a shot. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," he said finally. "But I understand what it costs a man to survive inside a lie that big for that long. I watched what it did to him those weeks he had me. It ate him alive from the inside just as much as it ate us." "That's not the same as forgiving him." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's a start." "Earl Danby's coming up next month," Wren added. "Wants to see the place. Says he's owed himself a visit for 17 years. "Good," her father said, and something in his voice carried real warmth for the first time all morning. "Man deserves to see what his stubbornness bought. Wouldn't have any of this without him. Wouldn't have you sitting here without a folder he was scared half to death to hand over." Wren looked out over the lake,
at the fence post where a lifetime of misses and one perfect shot had built the woman sitting on this porch. At the mountains beyond it, holding whatever came next.
Grimshaw, she said, facing charges that'll keep him in a courtroom for years, her father said. Won't undo 17 years. Won't give your mother back the time she lost by that window. But it's something. It's more than we had 2 months ago. It's enough, Wren said, quiet, certain in the way she'd learned to be certain about the things that mattered. Her father looked at her then. Really looked the way he used to look at her over the top of a rifle scope, checking her form, checking her breath, checking whether she was ready for the shot in front of her. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. The woman you became. The woman who went and found me. Wren's throat tightened. She looked down at the coffee cooling in her hands, at the steam curling up into the Montana morning the same way smoke used to curl from this chimney on mornings when she was the only one home. I had a good teacher, she said, even when he wasn't here, especially when he wasn't here. Her father reached over, rested his hand, still scarred, still trembling faintly from years of confinement, over hers. Discipline isn't what you do when someone's watching, Rennie, he said, quiet. The same words from a snow-covered morning 19 years ago, except this time they carried a different weight entirely. It's what you do when nobody is. I remember, she said. I know you do. His hand tightened over hers, warm despite the tremor. You never stopped. Later that morning, once the sun had climbed high enough to burn the last of the fog off the ridge, Wren helped her father up the slope behind the cabin, one slow step at a time, his hand braced on her shoulder, more than either of them wanted to admit was necessary. The grave sat where it always had, marked by the government stone that had never held a body, and beside it now a second stone, newer, cleaner, still sharp at the edges, the way fresh grief always was. Wren had chosen those last 2 words herself, over the objections of the man at the monument shop who thought they read strange on a headstone. She hadn't cared. It was the truest thing she could think to carve into stone about the woman who raised her. Silas lowered himself slowly to sit beside the grave joints, protesting, and reached out to rest his palm flat against the cool granite, the way he might once have rested it against his wife's living hand. I used to think I'd come home and explain it all to her, he said. Sit her down. Tell her every single thing that happened, start to finish, and she'd understand why it took so long. I had that whole conversation planned out in my head, years of it, rehearsed every version. What would you have told her? That I never stopped trying to get back to her? That every day I was gone was a day I spent hating whoever put me there more than I hated anything in my whole life? His voice roughened. That I was sorry. That I loved her every single one of those 17 years, even in a cell where I had no way of knowing if either of you were even still alive. Wren knelt beside him, laying her own hand next to his on the stone. She knew, she said. I think some part of her always knew. That's why she never moved that chair, never gave up the window. She wasn't waiting on hope, Dad. She told me once near the end. She said hoping has an end date. She was doing something steadier than that. She was standing guard, Silas said, quiet like the words cost him something to say out loud. Yeah, Wren said. That's exactly what she was doing. They sat there a long while, father and daughter, in the kind of silence that no longer needed filling. The wind moved through the pines above them, carrying the smell of the lake of pine sap of a Montana autumn settling in for the season. Somewhere below, smoke curled thin from the cabin chimney the way it always had, the way it would keep doing now, with 2 people inside instead of 1. I brought something, Wren said, eventually reaching into her jacket pocket. She drew out the old photograph, the one that had sat on her mother's mantel for 17 years, the one Marcia's folder had carried a copy of. 2 young men in fatigues, grinning at a camera like the world hadn't taught them anything yet. Her father took it with careful hands, studied it, a long moment, something complicated moving across his face. She kept this out the whole time? He said, not quite a question. Dusted it every week. I used to think it was just an old habit. I understand it differently now. Wren watched him trace a thumb over the edge of the photograph over a version of himself and Victor that no longer existed anywhere except in old pictures and older grief. I think some part of her was keeping faith with both of you, refusing to let either of you disappear completely even when the whole world told her you already had. Silas was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone thick in a way Wren had never once heard from him. Not even in the cell where she'd found him, not even at the worst of it.
I'm going to frame this, he said. Put it back on that mantle where it belongs, where she kept it.
I think she'd like that. I think she'd like a lot of things about how this ended, he said, looking out over the lake instead of at her, the way men of his generation looked away when a feeling threatened to become visible on their face. She'd like that you finished what I couldn't. She'd like that you did it with the same stubbornness she had sitting in that chair all those years, refusing to believe the easy version of the story. I had a good teacher there too, Wren said. Turns out. They stayed on the ridge until the sun climbed higher still, until the cold finally drove them back down toward the cabin and the coffee going lukewarm on the porch rail, and neither of them said much more because some mornings didn't need more words than the ones already spoken. It was enough, finally, to simply be two people standing over one grave instead of two in a place that had spent 17 years being defined by absence and was only now slowly learning what it felt like to hold presence instead. Behind them, the cabin sat quiet in the morning light. The rocking chair still faced the window, but it wasn't waiting anymore because the road outside didn't need to bring anyone home. He was already here. And out on the water, the fog lifted the rest of the way, slow and complete, revealing a lake so still it looked like glass, holding nothing underneath its surface but calm. For the first time in 17 years, there was nothing left for this family to wait for. Only finally something worth staying for. Somewhere behind them, up on the ridge, two headstones stood side by side in the morning light. One that had held nothing but a folded flag for 17 years, and one still sharp-edged with newness. Both of them, at last, telling the truth about the family who'd survived what they were never supposed to survive. And somewhere ahead of them, past the porch, past the lake, past the mountains, holding their patient, ordinary silence, an entire life waited that neither Wren nor her father had let themselves imagine in longer than either cared to admit. It wouldn't be simple, exactly. Grief this deep, never fully closed, not even with an ending this good. But it would be theirs, at last, together, however many quiet mornings still lay ahead for them to spend it.